I just wanted to talk about CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and why it's such an effective tool to have in your box if you're suffering from like anxiety, depression, stress, whatever it is, low self-esteem, confidence issues, social anxiety. Um, it's been found to help people with OCD, and PTSD, all these things. It's just such an effective tool, and the research also shows this with CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy, and um, like one of the things that I find so good with CBT is once you start applying some of the techniques, and I mean, you got to do them. You got to do them consistently for them to work. But if you look at some of the if you look at some of the neuroscience behind therapy and CBT as a psychotherapeutic treatment, it's I guess one of the most effective things with about CBT is that it creates these new neural networks that didn't exist, these new connections that didn't exist beforehand. And obviously, it takes a lot of time and practice and consistency to build these new connections, but that's exactly what it does. It builds these new connections. And I was reading once about anxiety and how and depression in some cases, how people who tend to be susceptible to anxiety and low mood and all that kind of stuff. It's There have been studies and scans that show that the part of the brain, the amygdala, which is the alarm system of the brain, people with anxiety disorders specifically have, even people with high anxiety levels. You don't necessarily have to have an anxiety disorder per se, but this amygdala seems to be really, really overactive. There's a lot of activity going on in this amygdala in this alarm system of the brain. And you can imagine, with an overactive amygdala, if the amygdala is the alarm system, it's the source of anxiety. Having an overactive amygdala is going to result in you being a highly anxious person. Now, the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain, is involved in rational logical thinking. And when we get into a low mood or we're feeling anxious, we must rely on the prefrontal cortex, which is logical and rational, to calm us down in some way. But what they found in these scans is people who tend to be susceptible to low moods and high anxiety levels, the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the alarm system, are quite weak. So you can imagine, if we think about it mechanically, if the part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logical, rational thinking, if it cannot communicate properly with the amygdala, which is, there's no rational thought, there's no logic with the amygdala, it's emotional. And if the logical part of your brain fails to effectively communicate with the emotional part of your brain, you're going to be overrun by emotions most of the time. And that's exactly what happens with people who are susceptible to depression and anxiety and stuff like that. And the one thing I love about CBT is, yes, you might have these poor connections between your logical and your emotional brain, but what you do in CBT, because you're responding to some of these thoughts these negative thoughts that contribute to your low mood or your anxiety, because you're actually forced to contend with them and write rational responses on a piece of paper, um, the act of doing that is building new connections, within your brain. So, and I would say you're building new connections between this prefrontal cortex, because when you're writing down rational responses to some of your negative thoughts that have led to your depression or your anxiety, which is what you do in CBT, you're using the rational part of the brain to come up with these rational responses. And the more you do that, the more connections you build. And I've found since starting my CBT practice, probably started about 3 or 4 months ago, and my depressive episodes have dramatically decreased. I've had a few, but nowhere near as much as what I had prior to taking on a CBT practice. And what I've found is every time I have a negative thought, the more I practice CBT in a journal, the easier it becomes for my brain to actually counteract some of these negative thoughts that prior to doing CBT I wasn't able to apply. My brain just didn't go there, and now I'm finding my brain more. It occurs more often that as soon as I have a negative thought, my brain will combat that automatically with a more rational response. And you can really see, this more automatic rational response that comes, the more that I apply CBT, the less effort it takes to come up with these rational, logical responses that combat some of these negative thoughts that once led to my depression or my anxiety. So it's quite evident there that, and researchers showed this as well, that when you apply CBT, you're actually building new connections, new neural connections in the brain. And this is really beneficial if you're someone susceptible to depression or anxiety and you have that overactive amygdala, and those connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala are just ineffective. Building those new neural connections with a CBT practice is really going to do you a lot of benefit. And like I said before, it kind of like mindfulness, where the more you practice, the more effortless it becomes. And that's exactly what I'm finding with negative thoughts and rational responses to negative thoughts. So, prior to my CBT practice, I'd have a negative thought and it would continue to spiral, and I'd have no response, or my rational responses were not powerful enough to combat these negative thoughts. But since practicing CBT, it's these rational responses becoming more and more effortless and more automatic. And I'm having less depressive episodes as a result. So I haven't done enough CBT in regards to my anxiety, and I'm finding I need to start doing more of that, because I'm finding that a lot of the time it's my anxiety that leads to the depression. But having that tool of CBT for depression, it's allowed me to identify the thoughts that lead to the depression. If you can identify that, if you have the awareness to identify what those thoughts are that lead to your depression, and then you can stop them in their tracks, rather than sitting on them and dwelling on them for too long, and letting them get out of control, um, which usually is the case when you spiral out into depression. But if you can identify them when they first hit you, and you can pick them apart with rational, logical responses, um, then you stop them in their tracks and you feel better instantly. You change. You go from a, I guess, the beginning of what would be a depressive episode, and you identify these thoughts, you pick them apart, and you come out of your haze, you come out of your depressive haze, and that's really powerful, especially in the case of preventing a depressive bout or a depressive episode, which you don't want, because they're excruciating and counterproductive. You want to stop it in its tracks. So, yeah, CBT. I advocate for CBT, and I'm going to continue to apply it, especially to, because the great thing about it is it's so diverse. You can apply it to not only depression, but apply it to other things like your anxiety, intimacy and relationships, which I've done a little bit on, trauma, issues with carried toxic levels of guilt and shame. And I'm in the middle of reading a book written by two financial psychologists and a financial advisor from the US, because I believe I have some negative beliefs about money that hold me back and make me stress unnecessarily about money. So I'm going to be applying the principles of CBT to some of these beliefs that I have about money, and pick them apart and reframe them and create new beliefs that over time will become more automatic in my thinking. And yeah, it's such a good way to rewire your brain. That's the in the most simplest terms, it helps with rewiring your brain, and that's such a powerful thing. Yeah, get into CBT.